Houston, Joe hoped to find a person named Natale, a barber he had known and liked in the army. But Natale had a long Italian surname, and Joe spent more than an hour in the bus station poring over the Houston telephone directory in unavailing efforts to find him. Before he gave up entirely, he had dialed away $8 worth of dimes. Then he went out onto the sidewalk for a first good look at Houston. Shit, he thought. This ain't no improvement on nothing. Don't look to me like this town needs any Joe Bucks in it. But they got one, goddamn 'em. He walked until he came to a hotel. It happened to be the one with the O missing in its sign, a cheap, dark place with poorly ventilated rooms and a bathroom floor always covered with water. It was a cold January day. He sat on the edge of the bed, wondering what to do about his predicament, and not quite certain just what the predicament was. He saw a future for himself sitting on the edges of hotel room beds, trying to get his thoughts straight. In 50 years, with that long white beard reaching to the floor, he would surely find himself in just such a place, asking himself why it was that the world everywhere was as peculiar as the world in Albuquerque, and why it was he found himself shut out of it. His only window gave on an air shaft, so that traffic sounds seemed to be heard only from a great distance. This silence, combined with his mood of uncertainty, put him under a kind of spell that lasted for several hours. Later, when he would think about them, these hours would remind him of a period in his childhood when the TV set had been out of order. Time had been an actual burden under which he was unable to move. It surrounded him like a solid mass through which movement was not only impossible, but inconceivable. And now, during these hours in the hotel room without the O, a chill entered him that had nothing to do with temperature or weather. It had more the quality of death about it. He was saved from this spell by sleep, a long sleep, and when he awakened, it was night. The memory of those damp and clammy hours was like the hand of a specter on the back of his neck. West in the USA. At first glance, these young men may appear to loiter in packs, for often they occupy one table or group about a single parking meter, but chances are they are as unconnected to one another as they are to the prairies and cities and rivers and their homeland. You will find in the eyes and demeanor of these persons a kind of restless sadness that is probably incurable. They seem to be suffering some nameless common loss, as if something of worth had been snatched from them with such shocking irrevocability that they have forgotten even what it was. Joe stood just inside the door for a moment, as if scanning this crowd for a familiar face. If he found such a face, he would go over to it and say, "Shit, man, where in hell you been?" And finding none, he was tempted to pick out some stranger to say it to, but that took nerve. He went up to the counter and ordered coffee and a hamburger, and while he was waiting, it happened that he found a face he liked. It was looking at him from a mirrored column in the middle of the counter. "Shit, man," he said to himself, but not aloud, admiring the good-looking, dark-eyed, tussle-haired, white-toothed image that returned his sweet cricket smile with such warmth and spontaneity. "Where the hell you been?" "Who, me?" he answered. "Christ, I don't know where all, but I'm back." And he and the mirror had a good laugh. And so Joe took to hanging around nights in this friendly place. One night he fell into conversation with the busboy, a pretty, rather sissified Mexican. "Poop, buddy mine," said Joe, who had begun to worry over his financial condition. "I'm about busted. They give you any kind of money in here, hauling all them dishes." "It's not make me rich," the boy shrugged. $1 each hour. "Yeah, but hell, you can eat stuff, right?" An idea was coming into bloom in Joe's head. "Isn't that right? Don't they let you eat stuff?" The next day, he got a job at the Sunshine. They put him to work on the afternoon shift, finishing at midnight. Joe liked the place so much that when midnight came, he stayed on, eating a big meal and then smoking over a coffee cup throughout most of the night. On his second night, the Mexican busboy stopped at his table, scanned him with his quick black eyes, and said, "At first, I thought you was hosteler." "Oh yeah? No, hell no." The next time the boy passed his table, Joe said, "Hey, what is that?" "Is what?" "That thing you thought." "Is what seeing I saw it." Joe said, "What you said, before." The boy frowned. "I am sorry, my English," he said, leaving with his tray. And on the next trip, he stopped and said, "I was sure you was hosteler." "That's it," Joe said. "What is that?" "A hosteler?" The Mexican boy at first was skeptical, then somehow convinced himself of Joe's innocence. "A hosteler is chica chica chica," he said, making a grinding motion with his hips and rubbing his thumb and forefingers together in a way that indicated money. "Comprende?" Joe had some loose themselves into a firm, clear thought. Ah, fooey, said the boy. Tu comprende muy bien. And with a switch of the tail, he was off to another table, where a group of his friends were gathered. This was a group Joe had noticed before with some interest. 5 young men. 4 were of one general type that tended to laugh a great deal, chatter more than usual, and gesture often. They dressed with a kind of ostentatious boyishness, and their eyes darted about the place like birds unable to perch. The 5th, however, was clearly of a different breed. He neither laughed, nor spoke, nor gestured. His attire seemed careless. Old Levi's, a faded denim shirt, dirty white sneakers. His hair, the color of sand, was loosely brushed to the side, and his eyes were, for the most part, still and remote. He listened to the chatter with some amusement, but no real involvement. And somehow, this detachment gave him superiority over the others. They were given sufferance so long as they continued to amuse him without making any demands upon him. He was clearly killing time and seemed to have no need of anyone at all. The Mexican boy stopped at this table, said something, and then went on toward the kitchen. The 4 turned to look at Joe, but the 5th did not. Instead, he rose, went to the counter for a fresh cup of coffee, and came directly to Joe's table with it. May I sit down? Joe was flustered and pleased. Oh, well, yeah. He got to his feet and began to shuffle chairs unnecessarily, unhinged by his sudden role of host. The visitor put out his hand and said, Perry. What's that? My name's Perry. Perry. Oh yeah. He took the young man's hand and shook it. Joe Buck, he said. Want a cigarette? They lit up, and then Joe found Perry looking at him. His eyes were peculiar, humorous, and touched with death. If a young person were to bring about his own untimely demise by some absurd and foolish blunder, these might be the eyes with which he would observe his own funeral. Not knowing how to cope with these eyes upon him, Joe laughed and shrugged his shoulders, faking the situation. Perry smiled faintly, and then stopped looking at him altogether. He simply leaned back in his chair, spread-legged, seeming to be totally relaxed and self-contained. He kept his eyes on the portion of the street visible through the large front window of the sunshine. There wasn't much doing out there. Occasionally a pedestrian passed, and now and then a taxicab cruised by. Joe was impressed by his own good fortune. Here he was sitting at a table with another person for the first time since he'd left the army. He was eager to prolong the situation, but uncertain what was expected of him. He thought of various ways in which he might initiate conversation, but if Perry had joined him in order to participate in his silence, Joe didn't want to spoil it all by talking. He developed very quickly a deep and mysterious admiration for this stranger named Perry. If some wizard capable of magical transformations were to have approached him with the proposition that he and this sandy-headed personage in Levi's might exchange identities. He would have seized the opportunity with no questions asked, and he would have been unable to give any reason at all. But it was this. Such people as Perry enjoy a special privilege. They walk into a place, and their favor is sought, and that's all there is to it. Often they are beautiful, but this is not always the case. The thing is that they are doomed, and have accepted their doom with a kind of deadly grace unusual in persons so young. And so, elated and uncomfortable, Joe sat in this young man's presence. After a few minutes, Perry's former company, the colorful four, got up and started toward the door. A tall, red-headed boy who seemed to be their leader led them past the table where Perry and Joe were seated. He said, "Good night, dear," and kept on moving. The second and third giggled, and the fourth, a short young man with a double chin, said, "Lots of luck." Joe watched as they filed out of the place, but Perry did not. He turned to Joe and looked at him briefly in a way that revealed nothing, and then continued to look out the window. This night was the beginning of a mysterious and silent friendship that lasted for some weeks. Each night when Joe finished his work and had eaten his midnight meal, Perry would wander into the place from no one knew where, and establish himself quietly at Joe's table. At first, there would be some minimum of talk between them, having to do with the fetching of coffee or the passing of sugar, but on many nights no words would pass between them at all. They would look out the window together, or sometimes they would observe an interesting said. Hell, man, I don't know, he said. But what he seemed to be saying was, I'm just waiting, that's all I know. On another night, in a similar way, out of the blue, Perry said, Do you make the scene? This was somewhat more of a question, but Joe was at a loss to answer it. Make the scene, he said, faking it. Yeah, that's right. Hell yes. He had no notion of what he was talking about. On these few occasions, when Perry did speak, his voice was deep and low, just a cut above a whisper, and intimate as the grave. One morning at dawn he said, Are you for real, Joe? And then he left the table and went out of the place, clearly not expecting to be answered at all. And then one night he looked at Joe in that very first way, the long look of that first night. Joe was nervous. It was time for something. He was desperately anxious to know what was expected of him. He puffed on a cigarette, stalling, hoping for inspiration. He laughed and wheezed, and shook his head knowingly, and tapped the table with his fingertips. And then, suddenly, almost involuntarily, he stopped all this false activity and sat still, simply looking at the man across from him. His eyes clearly said, Help me, but he had no idea any message at all was being transmitted. Perry nodded slightly. His eyes were sympathetic. Then the amusement in them became more pronounced than usual. And suddenly, all that could be seen in them was the mystery that was nothing more or less than his own doom. He turned his gaze on the street once again. It happened that at this moment, as if by some outlandish plan, the revolving door was spinning. A small man in a green necktie and brown tweed sport jacket was coming toward their table. .6. The man was young, about 30, but nearly bald, and he had a high, naked-looking forehead and burning, beady eyes that were enlarged many times over by the thick lenses of his spectacles. He looked like a mad young scientist in a silent movie. He stopped at the table where the two young men were seated. Perry, he said. Perry gave no sign of having heard his name spoken. Please, Perry, do you know how many times it's been this late? His voice lapped the ear with something caramel soft and caramel sweet. A long ash fell from Perry's cigarette onto his trousers. He brushed at it with his hand and went on smoking. Please, I said, Perry. No answer. I just want to ask you if you know what time it is. That's all. He changed his tack, took a chair from the next table, placed it in such a way that he faced Perry, then sat down with a deliberateness calculated to suggest that he could outweight any human being alive, folded his hands on his lap, and pressing his lips together and raising his thin black eyebrows, acquired an imposed upon look. He sighed and went to the counter. Joe smiled and said, "Hey, Perry, I bet you that fella's a brother of yours, right?" "Wrong." Returning with the coffee, Marvin placed both cups in front of Perry. Some aspect of the situation seemed to prohibit him from acknowledging Joe's presence at the table. Perry said, "Serve my friend, Marvin." Marvin slid one of the cups across the table toward Joe. "Thanks," Joe said. "Thank you a lot." He smiled at the big forehead and tipped an invisible hat to it, considering an absurd impulse to draw a picture on it. The man resumed his seat and his impassive stare, and said nothing. "My friend thanked you, Marvin." "He's welcome, Perry." "You're welcome, sir." Perry's voice did not alter. It was a warm, narcotic bath of sound. "His name is Joe, Marvin." "You're welcome, Joe." A moment passed. Perry said, "Marvin." "Yes, Perry." Perry put his hand forward, still not looking at the man. He seemed to place a high, benedictory value on his eyes and would not squander them on unworthy subjects. "Let me see your billfold, Marvin." "Oh, Perry, please." Perry's hand was still extended. "I meant immediately, of course, Marvin. I always mean immediately, unless I specify otherwise." Marvin placed his billfold in Perry's hand. "Oh, honestly," he said. Perry counted the money. There were 4 $1 bills. "How much is in your pocket, Marvin?" "What pocket?" Marvin said, quickly removing a hand from the side pocket of his tweed jacket. "That pocket," said Perry without pointing or even glancing in Marvin's direction. Marvin then handed over a small wad of bills which Perry held without counting. "How much is there?" he said. "Ch!" Marvin sighed. 70, he said. "You may have my portion then, Marvin." Perry handed back the billfold. "And I will have yours." He pocketed the $70 wad. "Now, I'd like the car keys, Marvin." "No, I absolutely refuse. Please, Perry." "Excuse me, Marvin. I didn't hear you. What did you say? You said something just now. Repeat it." "Oh, how am I going to get home?" "What's the matter? Are your feet just killing you, Marvin?" "Oh, Perry, why are you doing this? Is it to impress your friend?" "I'm sure your friend is very impressed." "I had planned," said Perry, "to come to your home tomorrow afternoon. However, you're behaving so poorly, Marvin. It may be necessary to adjust my plans." "What time?" Marvin said. "Late afternoon or early afternoon or what? Tomorrow." "The car keys, Marvin." "I'll give them to you. I'll give them to you. But say what time." "Are you suggesting a bargain, Marvin?" "Oh, don't whimper. You're whimpering, Marvin." Marvin smiled and tried to laugh, but all he could manage was a twitch of the eyebrows and a few minor explosions of breath. Joe by now had completed plans for the drawing he would never be able to place on Marvin's big blank forehead. A girl child with a long show his eyes, everything would be all right. But the spectacles clearly grew out of his face, like flesh and bone and muscle, and there was no removing them. Marvin got up and grabbed Perry's arm. Perry stood, stock still, holding the offended arm aloof from his body, his back to Marvin. "Remove your hand, Marvin, and sit back down." These commands were executed at once. "What time, then?" urged Marvin. "About 5? Or after? Or what?" Perry now turned for the first time to the little man with the many times magnified eyes and bestowed upon him a long, ambiguous gaze. It looked like contempt, but then again it looked like tenderness. "Sometime tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Now, I want you to sit still and stay that way till I've gone. Do you understand what I want?" "Tch," Marvin sighed. "All right, Perry." Perry would not remove his eyes until Marvin repeated what he had said, omitting the implication of resistance. "All right, Perry. And thank you." He threw in for good measure. Perry went through the revolving door, and Joe followed close behind. As they passed the window, Joe looked in at the little movie scientist. It was eerie to see him sitting there in motionless obedience, his thick glasses catching the light of the cafeteria at an angle that made them look like two high-powered flashlights following Perry's departure. "1.7. They were in the parking lot, Perry leaning on the fender of a white MG, Joe standing before him, thumbs caught in his hip pockets, smiling uncertainly, wondering what in the world was about to take place. The night was cold and clear, and the stars, like the possibilities, seemed brighter and far more numerous than usual. Joe laughed. Perry smiled and looked at him, and shook his head in the manner of one who is indulging a small child. "Joe," he said. He made frequent and gentle use of a name, knowing that to its owner it is likely to be the most sacred word in the language, reaching not only the ear, but the heart as well. "What are you laughing for, Joe?" Joe shook his head, still smiling. "Beats me." He laughed some more, trying, still, to pretend he understood everything, and yet fully aware he was merely making a fool of himself. "We got to get you cooled, Joe. We got to get you tuned in. Would you like that?" "Yeah, hell yeah. That's just what I need." "You don't know what I'm talking about, do you, Joe?" "Well, now, tuned in. That's to help you, but I want you to relax and trust me. Now listen, have you got a room near here? A room? Yeah, I got a room in a hotel. Let's go there then. Where is it? It's got an O missing. Where? I mean, do we walk or do we drive? Either way, we can just... How far is it, Joe? I'd say it was a few blocks. Get in. They parked the MG across the street from the place, walked past the desk clerk's cubbyhole, and up the stairs to Joe's room. Perry sat on the edge of the bed. I don't see a radio, Joe. Radio? No, I don't have a radio. Yet. I'm gonna get one, though. Make yourself at home, Joe. It's your room, isn't it? And you're with a friend, so relax. Joe sat on a straight-backed wooden chair. It'd make a lot of difference in here to have a radio. Yes, it would. It's very bad not having one. Joe said, I believe I'd like to have me a transistor. You know about them and all. Yes, I do. Well, I'm saving for one. Starting when? Tomorrow. A moment passed. Then Joe said, what I want one with some power in here. Not one of them little dinkies. He looked around the place, scanning the dark walls quickly. You understand what I mean? Exactly, Perry said. You want a radio with some power. You don't want one of those little dinkies. Perry placed a thin-hand-rolled cigarette in his mouth and lighted it. He sucked some smoke out of it, making a hissing sound, then held his breath and handed it to Joe. Joe tried to imitate Perry, but he gave away his inexperience by emitting the smoke at once. You don't know what you're doing, Joe. You must learn from me, and then you'll know. Now, he held the cigarette in the air between them. This is not tobacco, Joe. This is a special cigarette containing the dried leaves and flowers of a hemp known botanically as cannabis sativa. It's comparable to the high-powered, non-dingy transistor radio you're saving up for starting tomorrow. No, that's not quite true. You and I are the radios. The cannabis sativa is the, juice. Power. He stopped talking and filled his lungs again, using sign language to get the technique across to Joe. Together they finished the cigarette, and then they sat in silence for a few minutes, and then they smoked another one. Joe got up to open the window. Perry told him not to. Then Joe realized he was enjoying his own movements in a new way, and this caused him to smile. That stuff helps, he said. I believe it helps. Perry took the tiny ends of the 2 cigarettes they had smoked and tore them to pieces, dropping the fragments into the sink and washing them down the drain. Unlike tobacco, the butt of the cannabis sativa must be disposed of entirely, Joe. There. Hey, Joe said suddenly. That was marijuana. That cigarette had marijuana in it. That's right, Joe. Hell! Joe was delighted. No wonder I feel so nutty. You sure are one sneaky devil, Perry. He went about the room, testing his responses to movement, to seeing, to simply being, and he found them altered, heightened, and he felt more amused with himself than ever before. Perry lay back on the bed. He took a long while adjusting himself, and when he was spread out comfortably, ankles crossed, hands behind his head, he said, You comfortable there, Joe? I'm fine, Joe said. Is there anything you want, Joe? Oh, no, I'm fine. No, you're not. You're not fine, Joe. Huh? You need help. Do I? Oh, yes, definitely. And I, in concert with the cannabis sativa, am here for just that purpose, to help you find out what you want and show you how to take it. Joe felt as if his heart were filled with air. It might burst, and painfully, dangerously, he pressed on it with the palm of his hand. That didn't help at all. He picked up a book of matches and began to fool with it, trying to distract himself from the anxiety he felt. The matches were very real and definitely a relief. He bent them and twisted them and put them down and picked them up. Barry was still talking. It's not just tonight you don't know what to do with. Your whole life is a burden to you. You frown a lot, Joe, and you pick things up and put them down. You look pointedly at the book of matches. You have plans for burning down the world, but you're losing a lot of motion, a lot of time. You've got to get cool, find out what you want, and rule out everything else, and then you'll be cool as can be. Now, what have you got to do? Find out what I want. Correct. And then, rule out, Perry coached. Rule out everything else. Right. Now, again, find out what I want and rule out everything else. You're getting tuned in, Joe. That was lesson 1. Here's exercise 1. This room. What is there in it that you want? Just name it. Anything at all. And I'll see to it you get it. Joe started to scan the room with his eyes, and Perry said, "Look at me. Maybe that will help you, Joe." That's it. Now I'll ask you again. Is there anything at all you want? Joe studied Perry's face, straining to find a clue in it, but he found none. You know, Joe, there are people, and quite a few hundred of them at that, who would pay out considerable sums of money to be in your position right now, locked in a room with me and being asked what they want. Joe was actually dizzy from the mental effort he was expending. Another long moment passed. Then suddenly Perry was off the bed and standing before Joe's chair, looking down at him. His movement from the bed had been so quick as to be almost violent. The quiet of the place and the mood Joe felt had been instantly annihilated. And now a strange young man had hold of his shirt front, was gripping him in a way that compelled him to look up into his face. He was surprised to find no anger or violence in the man's eyes, as there had been in his movements. He was simply looking into Joe's face in a gently penetrating way, and when he had looked for a long moment, he said, "If we're going to be friends, Joe, there's just one rule." Joe felt he was living through some miracle. This stranger, a fine and handsome and knowledgeable and authoritative person, was turning his powers, his focus, his friendship upon such an unworthy object as himself. Surely he had made some mistake in judgment, selecting Joe Buck for his attentions. When he discovered his error, that would be the end of it. Meanwhile, Joe was terrified of making some wrong gesture, speaking some stupid giveaway word that would hasten Perry's departure. He tried to think up ways of stalling off this inevitable blunder, little words and gestures that would nudge it gently forward in time, but he wasn't up to it. He knew he wasn't up to it. Perry was too wise, too far ahead of the game. He couldn't be fooled. And the rule is, no crap. There is to be no crap. None. I am sick of people who know what they want and won't take it, won't even sneak up and name it. When I say to you, "What do you want, Joe?" you answer. You just say whatever that thing is you want. You understand me? Yeah. Yeah, I do, Perry. I do. That's good. His face broke gradually into a smile, and then he released Joe's shirt front and sat on the edge of the bed, bridging with his eyes the few feet of closed his eyes and frowned, inclined his head toward his body, as if what he wanted were trapped somewhere in his stomach, and might be conjured out of him by an act of will. Just say it, Barry encouraged him. Whatever it is. Hopeless. I'm hopeless. Oh, Jesus Christ, he thought. The truth is an ugly son of a bitch. He lifted his shoulders, wanting his face to disappear into his body. When he opened his eyes, he half expected Barry to be on his way out the door. Instead, he was looking at him as gently as ever, and with even more concern than before. Why? Tell me why you're hopeless, Joe. Shit, Barry. I may as well tell you. I'm dumb. I am one dumb sumbitch. I don't know shit. I can't talk right. I can't think straight. He laughed, but his face was grave. He saw nothing funny at all, for he had hung some ugly, ungainly, unforgivable thing in that air between them, and it had to be pushed away. He hammered at it with his laughter, but he couldn't get at it. The more he laughed, the bigger it got. Suddenly he saw in his mind a beautiful picture. Sally Buck's gravestone, pure white and utterly blank, and needing to be filled in. Inscribed. The crayon in his head drew a quick sketch on the stone, a cartoon of himself, and that somehow made him easier. The picture was complete. He could look at Perry again. I keep thinking, he heard himself saying, somewhat to his surprise, that what I'll do is, I'll keep washing them dishes, and then they'll bring in some more, and I'll wash them, and then I'll come up here and sleep some, and then I'll wash some more dishes, and then you'll what? He put his arm forward and shook it, waving his hand back and forth as if to indicate that the word was somewhere in the room. Just say it, Joe. Die. Oh, shit. What kind of thing to hang in the air is that? Kill it, kill it. He tried one quick, harsh blast of laughter. No, that wasn't going to get rid of the thing. Nothing would. It was too big, too ugly. In his mind, there was a shovel, and he placed the shovel in his hands of some shadowy creature, and this creature set about using the shovel to dig a grave next to Sally's. And then there was an open coffin sitting next to the new grave, and the coffin had a beautiful young person in it. Himself. Oh, God damn it, he thought. Is that all I get? Just a coffin for all my being young. A coffin for all my juice and all my good looks. The sadness of it overwhelmed him, and suddenly he was crying, writhing on the floor, and that hotel room without the O, looking at a stranger's dirty sneakers, gasping for breath. He felt the necessity of getting that stranger out of the room, and he said, "Go." But that was all he could get out. There was something inside of him now, far bigger than his lungs, and it was using up all the space where breathing was supposed to take place. And not only that, it was poking at his liver and into his heart and all his vital spaces, and it hurt like a handful of knives in him. The dirty sneakers had a person in them. What's it want? What's it want with me? What's this sumbitch want with me? His mind demanded over and over again. Don't he know I'm the stranger took hold of his shoulders and pushed him onto his back with great force, and then Joe was being sat upon, straddled by him. These actions were sudden enough to drive out the big, sharp-edged, heavy horror that was in him. Now he breathed was the marijuana. That's all. It wasn't his fault. He looked at Perry, straddling him there, and at his face, hovering very near his own, and he heard him speak in his friendly, deep, sweet, and dark narcotic voice. And now I'll bet you feel a whole lot better, don't you, Joe? Pinned. He was pinned down by somebody friendly, wise, calm, good. At last. What now? So now, Perry continued, all you got to do is let me know. Give me a signal what you want. Otherwise, how can I give it to you? Who is this bird setting on my belly? Is he God? Is he Santa Claus? Is he magic? Give me what I want. Is he crazy? He asked me once again, just once more. I'll tell him all right. Tell him I want me a blonde lady to fuck and have her take care of me all my life. A blonde lady with long eyelashes and fat, dimply knees. Got to have meat on them knees and wear a yellow dress with real tits inside. No foam rubber like poor old Sally. And be home a lot and bring me stuff to eat in front of the TV. And her come up to me during the horseshit part and say to me, Cowboy, I love you so. And have her cry about how much she loves me. I'll say to her, I never in my life seen anybody love somebody as much as you love me. How come is that anyway? And then have her say, with her voice milky as her tits, Why I love you? 'Cause you're a cowboy, Joe Buck. And you do me so good, and you don't waste your juice trying